Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today. So I hope everyone had a chance to have some lunch or something to eat. And before we start the sessions now in the afternoon, yeah, it's the sad thing of this kind of presentation is that now this is a one-way feedback. I have no way to look at the faces, but I think we're all learning to deal with this in this pandemic world. Anyways, so thanks again for joining. And the purpose of today's conversation is going to be around some of the learnings that we've acquired at the Vector Institute through our collaboration with the financial service partners that we work with, as well as the multiple technical conversations that we keep having. So I will start by sharing with you the agenda for today. The idea is to start with a quick introduction about us. Basically, most of you, or a big chunk, I hope, knows who we are. But for those of you who don't, it's important to set the context in terms of who the Vector Institute is and what we do. Then some working definitions, because again, many of the topics that we'll be discussing are very generic, and I want to be specific in terms of what we are talking when we say AI, when we say these other things. Hopefully, we'll get through all of this in less than the first 5 minutes. And then we'll get into the relevance of ethics and governance for AI and machine learning. And the big question there is why are we talking about this in the first place, which is not necessarily about doing the right thing. I mean, of course, we want to do the right thing, but the point is we need to know when we're not doing the right thing, right? And that is the part where machine learning has some challenges. Then the next part of the conversation is to discuss how we can go through that from in an incremental way. The idea is not to get rid of everything that we have, but actually to design ways to move forward, right, incrementally. So there are some insights on that space that I want to share with you guys. And finally, the last point is some practical tips of what we've identified and some of the next conversations that we are engaging in with our sponsors and with other people in the community that want to participate. So just to start with the introduction to Vector Institute. So we are a research institute that is driving research excellence and leadership in AI. And but the second part of the line in the vision aspect is to foster economic growth and improve the lives of Canadians. So even though our research is theoretical and it's very high level, what we're trying to do is to facilitate the inclusion of that new knowledge into the day-to-day into the Canadian industry. So in terms of the funding, just to give you an idea of the size of the company, of what Vector is, we managed to get over $135 million in funding for the first 3 years. And we have 3 main pillars, so which is roughly 1/3 each. So we have 1/3 of federal funding, then we have 1/3 of the provincial funding, and then the other third is what we call the industry sponsors. So we have over 40 companies that work actively with us. Then, in terms of our research capabilities, we have over 500 researchers, so around 135, 140 are faculty members, other members or affiliates, and then you have a body of over 370 people that are dedicated to study machine learning and artificial intelligence, either in master's programs or PhDs, working with these researchers. So in terms of the kind of things that we do, we have 4 main areas. So one is knowledge creation. Then we also work with the talent pool. We also work to facilitate adoption and thought leadership. So when we're talking about knowledge creation, for example, this is advanced AI research. Typically, we are not focusing on things that have been solved, but things that don't have an answer yet. Then for the talent pool expansion, we're working with the universities to align in terms of what kind of programs they are offering. We're also offering scholarships, and we also facilitate the connection between the students and potential employers. Then in terms of the facilitate adoption piece, We're also working with these industry sponsors that I was mentioning, and we have projects in particular, as well as courses and other things, but I want to focus on the projects in particular because many of the learnings that I wanted to share today originated actually in some of these collaborations where some of our sponsors are working to apply the learnings that we have acquired and that they have acquired. So it's not just they learning from us, it's also learning from each other and trying to figure out what things need to be done to facilitate a practical implementation of AI. And the last part, the thought leadership, is about publication of white papers and studies that are publicly available. We also typically release code, and we focus on ethical topics of AI, which is, again, part of what this conversation is included in. So just to set the context in terms of what we're going to be talking about, artificial intelligence is quite a broad topic. It's been around since the 50s, and the point is there were multiple different domains. Machine learning in particular is the one that became relevant over the last few years. And even within machine learning, our focus has been mostly around deep learning, because deep learning has been kind of redefining most of the traditional fields of artificial intelligence. So basically, whenever I'm talking about artificial intelligence, I'm going to be referencing mostly deep learning techniques. Most of what I'm going to say also apply to machine learning a little bit more in general, but keep in mind that our area of focus is usually deep learning, right? So the other point that I wanted to make is in terms of the significance of machine learnings, of why we think that this is something that requires this conversation. In particular, when we're talking about the economic drivers, so there is a big chunk of machine learning that is around decreasing the cost of prediction, and most of the economic challenges can be articulated, and the business challenges can be articulated as trying to guess what someone is going to do. For example, trying to guess what is the value of a certain stock in the future, or trying to guess what is going to be for example, the preferred product by a user, and so on. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that this is not something that is here just in a whim. This is going to stay. The other piece is there is significant impact on infrastructure cost. So there is a lot of decreasing cost decreasing marginal cost. As you build more machine learning solutions, the cost of building the new one is going to decrease over time. The other piece, which is also particularly important, is once packaged, it is invisible, and this brings it to the same category as internet or as cell phones. You don't need to be an expert to actually take advantage of it. As probably most of you know, cell phones are a good example of that. Even though you may not be conscious that you're using AI, just functions like autocorrect are heavily dependent on machine learning, right? So the other point is the technical transformation. So the current status quo of what we are doing with our technical domain was designed for an inherently different structure. So in particular, when you're talking about rules versus data, the problem is when you're creating rules, you need to really understand what you're trying to model. While when you're using data, you may be able to get a working model without fully understanding what is driving your model. But the problem is your model, because of that lack of exact definition, it may become erratic from your perspective. So then there is the whole deterministic versus probabilistic kind of thing. You may get, even using the same data, the same approach, you may get different models, basically models that predict different numbers in border cases, which again require in very similar contexts, right? So that makes it a little bit harder to regulate or to provide governance for. And the final thing is the emergent behaviors and the feedback loops. Again, machine learning is extremely volatile in that regard. So all of these pieces need to be included when you are designing governance. So the reason why I wanted to go through all of this is because the conversation that is going to follow around what we're trying to do in terms of governance needs to be informed by all of those considerations. Basically, the message of this slide is that machine learning is different. and we need to build governance for that, right? So now we're getting into the actual meat of this conversation. And basically the key message that I wanted to deliver in this slide is the headline: powerful algorithms require higher ethical standards. Part of the problem is AI has been being brought to the attention of the mass public through multiple different missteps, right? And the point is, these domains were not readily available 20 years ago, right? Even 10 years ago. And part of it is that because of all of the changes that we've seen in technology, AI now enables these widespread, frequent, and invisible interactions. So examples like online ads, search recommendations, social media, it's way more prevalent. And again, it's completely invisible, and it's nudging at people the whole time, basically, even when they are not aware that that is going on. Then the specialized life-changing interactions, we have certain domains that were exempt, like law, medicine, and finance, that now are core areas or areas that are ripe for machine learning techniques to explore them. And then finally, we have these human-like interactions without human intervention, right? So part of the challenge here is that natural language processing or computer vision or even generative networks, basically, all of those techniques can produce elements that are very difficult to differentiate from a human, or actually kind of in some ways replace what humans used to do in these roles. So the bottom line here, and this is where I'm starting to draw from the conversations that we had with our sponsors, is that we need to adjust the governance structure. So what we did, for example, in this particular case, working with 7 financial services companies, 5 consulting companies, and other technology-oriented companies, what we did was we looked at a framework, model risk management framework. This one in particular was proposed by McKinsey originally, and then what the group did was modify some of those, some of the original framework proposed by McKinsey, so it would be more suitable for their own interpretations. And what we did then is we started saying, okay, so what would need to change, or what are the focus areas that are relevant when we're talking about machine learning? And the point is, or the finding is that it's not radically different, it's not radically new, right? So what we identified is that there are multiple areas where the standard framework that has been used for machine learning is all you really need, right? However, there are some areas that you need to focus your attention on. So in particular, we have fairness governance is something that typically has not had a separate box, so to speak. But it's an element that, in our perspective, needs to be added to the whole conversation. Similarly, you need to be more careful with what is called dynamic calibration. So if you want to have something that is learning on the go, that is another area of focus. And for example, another case is production readiness, where typically when you're developing the models, production readiness, if you want to call it that, it's a given in the sense that they are designed and built from the beginning with that approach in mind. In this particular context, you may need additional layers of governance to ensure that that happens. In addition to those 3 areas that are, let's say, new, there are other areas that we identified, in particular, development data sets, statistical bias, the general theory, modeling techniques, and so on. Basically, all the areas that are darkened in this in the slide that I'm sharing, that requires some additional thinking, that requires some additional tweaking from the way that we used to do things before, right? So the overall message in this is we can use some of the best practices identified with traditional models to actually tweak those to be effective at handling the challenges that you may have with machine learning. Along the same lines, the other message here is you don't need to do all of these steps. There are many of these steps that actually can be used more as a general, I don't know if to call it guideline, but as a general checklist, if you want, of things that can be tried and can be used as a way to approach the challenge. So think of this as checklists, right? Whenever you are implementing machine learning, if you want to be reliable in your implementation, you need to have most of these points. It doesn't matter if they all are being done by the same person, basically. The point is you need to know that you are exploring each and all of these components before you consider these to be ready for let's say, mass production, right? So I wanted to go in a little bit more detail and on this fairness governance aspect, just to give you an example. So I'm going to use it more as a use case study, more as a case study, rather than in-depth detail. The point is all of these have a lot of meat behind. The point is how you actually build those things. You need to follow a certain approach. And what we're suggesting is that the approach that should be used for all of these exploration, for all of these preparation of the governance in order to be trustworthy, should be focused on principles rather than a case-by-case kind of approach. So the principles that, for example, we are suggesting for fairness are, first of all, fairness at every stage, transparency and interpretability, the diversity of the stakeholders group, and involving humans when necessary. So from the perspective of fairness at every stage, the bottom line of this one is that whenever you're talking about fairness, is not just about one step in the process, right? Which is what the name says. So in particular, you need to ensure that your data is not introducing biases in your process. You need to ensure that your modeling stage doesn't have biases also. And then when you are in the application stage, you also need to have tests. So what that translates into creating an actual infrastructure where you have the pipelines, the technical pipelines, to do the tests ahead of time. So you don't need to be building this infrastructure for every single project. So you start with one project. For that project, you build the pipeline. The pipeline may need to be adjusted, but the bulk of it should be fairly robust to manage different needs for to test for fairness, for example. Then transparency and interpretability. In general, you should try to build your models in a way that that you can provide a rationale for the result. That means that you should be doing kind of designed interpretability rather than post-hoc interpretability, for example. There are elements like that that are particularly important. And those should be, again, an ongoing concern. It's not something that you just say, for this model, we're going to take this consideration. It's always part of the conversation. So you need to have that kind of checklist or those principles to guide that conversation. So as time passes by, you always have that awareness of what needs to be done. Then diverse stakeholders, same thing. You need to have the infrastructure to actually build those pieces. It shouldn't be something that is left for chance, right? And finally, the involving humans when necessary. This is not just having humans on the loop, it's actually building your pipeline in a way that humans can intervene. So these elements may sound light when you just mention them on the passing. The point is, if you really want to do this as part of your ongoing routine, if you want to call it something, of part of your governance, you need to build the infrastructure to actually achieve that, right? So that last step, involve humans when necessary, it's a big one, because you need to build infrastructure to provide that, and that means pipelines, that means resources. You need to have people that are actually monitoring these things. You need to have alerts. You need to have multiple things, multiple ways to interact with the system. So none of these pieces should be afterthoughts. That's basically what I'm trying to arrive at. So now going to the almost final slide. What we are suggesting in general when we're talking about governance or something trustworthy governance, right? You should articulate those principles. Whenever you are thinking about what you're trying to achieve with these initiatives, with these trustworthy initiatives, what you're looking at is what kind of principles do you want to apply? And this is not, there is no one size fits all here. So in some cases, it will depend on the industry, it will depend on the corporate values, it will depend on the risk appetite. But these are some of the examples that I think are relatively common. You should be mindful of reliability, which is kind of a non-starter. Everyone needs to ensure that their models are reliable. But in addition to that, security, fairness, transparency, and privacy, for example, are particularly common, but there are more. So for example, accountability. How do you know who's making the call on each of these pieces? What you want to avoid is your models leaving you in a no man's land where nobody really take ownerships of the decision being made. And basically everyone start pointing fingers at each other. There are other things like auditability. How do you ensure that your models are capable of being audited? All of those pieces are not as trivial as they look or as they sound. So building those pieces require in-depth conversations. And again, there is no one size fits all. So the important thing, and that is where the first bullet comes in, articulating these guiding principles is particularly relevant for these purposes. Then the guidelines are the next iteration in terms of how you actually start to drill down. And in this particular case, what you're trying to differentiate is by how material this particular business case is, what kind of customer impact are you expecting from this model, and the kind of techniques that you're using. Then the other piece, when you're talking about how do you actually implement this in a way that is efficient and cheap, so to speak, focus on standardized tests and metrics. There are lots of libraries that actually can deliver relatively easy to implement these pieces. But the point is, your library is not going to be static. It's going to evolve over time. Don't try to achieve perfection from day one. The point is, well, and I'm going to get to that in the last point, but I'm going to jump into that right now. These things are going to evolve over time, and they're going to get better. So the main suggestion is when you're building all of these frameworks that will enable you to have trustworthy AI, start from non-core areas. Build gradually. So for example, you can see that today there is a lot of companies that are focusing on chatbots, for example. Those kind of elements are relatively easy to standardize. And the point is, when you're building those, you realize all the things that can go wrong. And by doing that, you learn in an area that is relatively easy to manage. But at the same time, the infrastructure that you need to build for governance is the same kind of infrastructure that you will need to build in other domains. So start with these non-core use cases that will help you to land on the right structure for your needs. And the other piece is, you already have a governance structure. Just whatever it is that you're doing today, you are ensuring that that is being done according to certain quality standards. So that piece is the relevant part. You need to just focus on building on that structure, right? In particular, build on the AI capabilities. You are aware of how machine learning works. So now the point is, let's start building all of these elements one by one, gradually, right? So as long as you ensure this diverse representation, or you build towards that, and you also build towards trying to automate pieces to achieve consistency, those are the elements that will become a little bit more, will make it easier for you to manage things over time. Just the final slide that I had to share is we are starting 2 initiatives now with sponsors again, but part of the idea is to continue these conversations. So one of them is, how can we build collaborative strategies to actually accelerate AI? That means within the companies and between companies, having common frameworks, for example, for sharing resources, sharing data, sharing computing power, sharing expertise. All of those pieces can help, especially companies that want to remain agile in this world. Those can be particularly efficient, right? So that is one of the pieces that we're focusing on. And the other piece is trustworthy AI principles and practices. So far, we've been focusing on the governance and the principles. The challenge now is, how do we actually implement these things and I'm talking about code, right? How do you build libraries? How do you build for specific use cases? How do you build those pieces? So that is the other adventure, basically, that we are going to be exploring with our sponsors. So starting in October, we're going to be focusing on that piece. So the first piece now in the summer is Accelerate AI, and then October, basically fall and winter, we're going to be focused on the other piece, that is how to implement these things, right? So that is basically what I had in the as a presentation. Now I see a question, which is Kaima is asking for the small team, which has very limited resources. Do you have any suggestion to apply these principles you mentioned? Yes. So the very first thing, which I already mentioned, is don't aspire for perfection. I don't think that anyone is really trying to do that. So that means that you're going to be building on the basis that you've already deployed. Having some principles to guide this conversation will help you to prioritize things, because you won't be able to do everything from the beginning. And quite often, many of these of the goals that you have for machine learning are mutually compete against each other, right? So in particular, if you want to be fair, or if you want to be interpretable, there are things that that make your life harder. The more that you, even when you're talking about performance, if you're trying to achieve extreme fairness, right, and you protect by multiple different type of features, it's going to be actually very difficult to have a good performance in your system, right? So my recommendation of the principles is just a way to structure what you're trying to achieve. Then the guidelines for each of these principles, the only thing that will do is it will help you to prioritize at a second level, how do you apply this principle to this specific use case, right? So there are some frameworks out there that you can use as checklists. So many of especially when you're talking about small teams, and when you have a narrow scope, typically you won't really need all of the elements, right? But the important thing is you need to think about them. So my recommendation in general is to use those frameworks as a checklist, so you are aware of what it is that you're not doing, right? Yep. So I have another question here, which is, what are practical practices for transparency and inclusivity? Okay, so if we go, so there are two levels here. One is at the governance level, the other is at the code level. When we're talking about at the governance level, first, the most practical thing is have a sounding board. And by that, I mean have a diverse group of people, especially when you're in a small company. You may not have a diverse group of people working in the company. So the point is, how can you go and explore this with others, right? So my recommendation is try to have some sort of advisory board. Typically, you can get people to volunteer for those kind of roles when you're a small company. When you're a large company, it's easier to source these kind of things. But basically, the point from a governance perspective is have people with a diverse range of experiences providing that kind of feedback. From a practical standpoint, when you're talking about implementing and code base, I would suggest, first of all, it needs to be a risk-based approach. So what is the impact? So the other question when you're talking about practices and when you're talking about transparency and inclusivity, the key element that drives this is who you are aiming as a counterpart. For example, if you want to be transparent for a customer that has no idea what you're doing, right, the type of answer that you will need to deploy is quite different than if you're thinking about being transparent to, for example, a regulator or an auditor, right? So depending on the type of interaction, you may need to choose different tools. When you're talking about, for example, a customer, right, tools like counterfactuals, if you go with or directional interpretability, for example, may be good tools to apply because they give something that is that intuitively makes sense. When you're talking about someone that is an expert in the field and you just want it for validation purposes, probably you want to resort to other tools like Shapely Values or elements like that. That again, you have the libraries out there. There is nothing secret about them, but that is what it will give you the opportunity to explore. What is the appropriate technique? At the end of the day, this is not about trying to boil the ocean, right? What you're trying to achieve here is something that is measurable and something that over multiple steps will get you to the point where you want to be. So having these things articulated actually helps a lot to facilitate this discussion. So that would be in general my recommendation on how to approach it. So the technical perspective, you have lists of things. It's relatively easy to find implementations. I think that the part where I'm trying to help with the conversation is mostly on the governance piece. When you have multiple people involved, how do you articulate that thought and how do you facilitate that conversation internally, right? And we are all at time now. I don't know if there is any other question. Okay, so anyways, always happy to connect and happy to chat if there is any other questions or topics.